Do you want to learn more on how to put money to work in regenerative food and agriculture? Follow our video course via investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/course or in the links below. Now, on to the podcast. This is a deep dive into regenerative agriculture and food with an ag tech veteran. How to help farmers make better decisions. Welcome to another episode of Investing in Regenerative Agriculture, investing as if the planet mattered. Podcast show where I talk to the pioneers in the regenerative food and agriculture space to learn more on how to put our money to work to regenerate soil, people, local communities and ecosystems while making an appropriate and fair return. Why my focus on soil and regeneration? Because so many of the pressing issues we face today have their roots in how we treat our land, grow our food and what we eat. And it's time that we as investors, big and small, and consumers start paying much more attention to the dirt/soil underneath our feet. In March last year, we launched our Patreon community to make it easy for fans to support our work. And so many of you have joined as a member. We've launched different types of benefits, exclusive content, Q&A webinars with former guests, Ask Me Anything sessions, plus so much more to come in the future. For more information on the different tiers, benefits and how to become a member, check patreon.com/regenerative agriculture or find the link below. Thank you. Today I'm joined by Stephanie Race, founder of Crop Performance and Earth Labs, providing predictive analytics for agriculture, land and water resources, creating resilient landscapes, and demystifying the science for farmers and helping farmers make better decisions. Welcome, Stephanie.
Hi, Koen. How are you?
I'm really good. I'm very excited for this interview. We have 1.5 million things to discuss, which we're never going to get to in one interview, but we have to get going. So I would love to ask you the first question I always ask, and you've been listening to the podcast, so you know, how did you get into soil? Because you weren't raised on a farm. You are not a farmer at the moment. How did you get to soil, regen ag, water quality, etc.?
Okay, thanks for having me today. I'm delighted to participate in your podcast series. I just wanted to commend you for your efforts to jump into a topic that we've been working in for about 10 years, and continuing to educate the marketplace is a big piece of what needs to happen. So we got involved in soil health, water quality, and greenhouse gas emissions monitoring at the very beginning of the company. My inspiration for crop performance had to do with my work previously in the supply chains of food and consumer products companies, where we understand that the food manufacturers need better visibility to their raw material supply. And one of the key aspects of the data sets that they're clamoring for is to get a better understanding of commodity price fluctuation, which drives the margin of most food and consumer products companies. And that started to shift in 2008. And then we had a Walmart compliance mandate come back and say the top 50 suppliers to Walmart needed to supply sustainability analytics, and none of the major food companies could agree as to what that meant, and then what it meant to the growers that they were sourcing crops from to manufacture food products for consumers. So we decided at the very beginning that we needed to develop a robust set of metrics for something we were calling sustainable agriculture, which has now evolved to regenerative over the last, say, 8 years. And I can honestly say it has been a learning journey. We have progressed something from looking at a simple understanding of a problem set that said we need to become more resource efficient in the production of food by applying the right amount of fertilizer and water to get a crop to perform at a higher profit per acre, just a standard economic value proposition around resource use efficiency, to actually defining a business case for soil health and the other externalities related to crop production. And this three-tiered understanding, which is productivity, sustainability, and risk management, has now become the foundation for our company. Soil plays a role in everything that we do. We have soil fertility monitoring services, both for crop productivity as well as for soil carbon sequestration, as well as greenhouse gas emissions monitoring. So we use our soil monitoring technology as a fundamental part of the platform.
And can you name an example of a very exciting client or a very exciting process you've been part of? How did you help farmers make better decisions? Could be one like quite a while ago when it was all much simpler and we were talking about sustainable agriculture. Could be something on the regen ag side very recently. But what would you share if you would have to share one.
Yeah, we have several case studies. I would say we've been working in the potato supply chain for about 8 years for the major French fry and potato chip companies globally in a range of different geographies. And our work in North America has started out by providing in-season yield forecasts to understand what the yield was going to be at the end of the harvest, and working with the potato growers in this consumer packaged goods company supply.
Sorry to interrupt, but that basically means you're helping the potato chip manufacturer, the potato chip company, to understand how many potatoes might be coming to the factory, or what does that mean?
It means how many potatoes from which field and which variety are going to be harvested when, and when will they be available for use in a factory. So it's essentially supply planning all the way down to the field scale in their supply chain. So you may have an organization like ConAgra or PepsiCo that has something like up to 50 or 100 potato growers in North America that supply, 5 or 20 factories, depending upon what they're manufacturing. They have a supply plan, and it's highly dependent upon what's in storage versus what's coming off the fields. And in the potato chip and French fry business, you're growing different potato varieties for different end uses. So understanding what the portfolio of available supply of any potato variety volume at any location becomes critical to their business.
Absolutely fundamental, yeah.
Yeah. So it's more about minimizing supply chain disruption and working with growers on how to create a more profitable, reliable business. From the grower's point of view, it's really about staying in business and staying out of trouble. The stuff about quantifying the environmental impact of food production is relatively new. When we started the company, we called it Earth Analytics Group, thinking this is what we're doing, climate smart agriculture. And in 2013, we were encouraged by a number of growers to change the name of the company to Crop Performance, because they really wanted us to focus on the business case for producing higher yield of quality potatoes at a certain cost of production so they could stay in business and meet their customer commitments. So the job one was all about making them commercially reliable if they weren't to begin with. And I think that's a big missing gap in the discussion around regenerative. The question becomes, how does, shifting from, say, conventional, how does that deliver on reliability of supply to make these growers more competitive? Because they need a business case. And I can't emphasize that enough. So back to the case study, I would say, while we started out with a simple view towards making the supply chain more reliable by providing the food processor with in-season yield forecasts and the growers with analytics tools to show them what was driving the variability in production in the crop yield on a field-by-field basis, to advise them on, they've applied too much water too soon in the season, they get poor establishment, or they've missed their nutrient application by 2.5 weeks, and they're not going to make their numbers as a result of that. Providing them with in-season tools to manage production at the field scale around something we call limiting factors, which are all the different attributes that growers look at in terms of things they can control. They can't control the weather, but they try and control soils, and they try and control management, which involves irrigation, crop nutrition, crop protection. So back to the dials on the dashboard, I would say our biggest wins in terms of delivering the most value to our customers, both the food companies and the growers, has been where we've been able to help growers anticipate and act in time to actually make a difference relative to their commercial commitments. Oftentimes in the United States and even in the UK and Europe, you'll see growers that struggle with something we call the resilience of their soils, meaning they want to future-proof their farms so that they don't have surprises during the season. And that's really where our work in soils went from just managing soil fertility within a single season for a given crop, like a potato crop for a potato chip manufacturer, to something where we're looking at how can we plan soil fertility across multiple seasons on one field.
So you get into the rotation side of things. I would love to unpack that further, but one step back, how do you get all that data from a specific field? Is that field visits, satellites, a lot of sensors? And how are you able to get the farmer and also the company, obviously, that's making the potato chips, that kind of detailed information?
So we have 3 different data collection methods that come into one platform. So we have dynamic and static data. So the dynamic data is information about phenology of a given location, then meteorology, and then soils. So we have 3 different dynamic data sets that are input to the platform. And then the static data sets, oftentimes we work with growers to record some level of past production. We know from our satellite remote sensing and our land use classification models, we can work out exactly what was growing where in a past season. So oftentimes we start a pilot project by running something we call a hindcast, which uses these dynamic data sets to mimic past seasons of production. And then we may or may not have access to grower management data, like how much water did they apply in irrigation and what crop protection, fertilizer, or soil fertility treatments did they use in a given season, in order to play back to them how much better could our system make them if they were using it in the past season of production.
Basically going back and say, if you would have used us, we even without, you could even do that without asking them, as you have access to this aerial data.
Yeah, exactly. So that is part of sometimes it's a pre-sales activity. Sometimes we get paid to do a hindcast, but it's essentially creating a retrospective view on the productivity of a given piece of land with the use of our platform.
And then this year rotations become very interesting, obviously, as you can see changes, or you can start looking back / predicting, okay, what happens if you take a longer view?
Yeah, so we build that intelligence up front on every project. And the historical remote sensing archive that we developed over the company's been going for about 10 years, but our historical data is about 40 years of historical data. And I started building it 10 years before I started the company. That's why this is a retrospective development of the data set becomes something that's really a differentiated capability for our company, not just for the past, say, 2 or 3 years, but we can go back in time to run data against past seasons of production or past land use classes. Like in the case of a watershed, we might be looking at how many times did this land change from a forest to a grazing paddock for livestock to a vineyard, for example. And then how many times did it change back?
Which on a landscape scale is extremely valuable. As you see I see many ag tech companies, you see many colleagues / competitors looking at data for maybe 2-3 years. And that's simply not enough, especially if you start looking at large water catchments, river systems, and being able to see what a forest to pasture to vineyard does to the soil. It's something you need 40, 50, 60, 100 years of view, basically.
Yeah, and we do more than just capturing static data. We run it through our model execution platform to provision the analytics. So we have 3 different layers of data, if you will. The first layer is both static and dynamic that can produce these hindcasts as well as nowcasts and forecasts. I would say back to the case study, what we've done is transition some of these potato growers to regenerative practices where we're now incorporating soil fertility treatments and cover crops into the rotation, moving them to no-till system where they're not actively cultivating the soil in order to plant crops. Minimizing disturbance and in some cases incorporating livestock grazing into the rotation as a fertility treatment to see how we can increase the productivity of potatoes in a future season on a given field. So our work has transcended just looking at this as a 2-dimensional problem. We need to monitor the productivity of crops on a field in a season and then job done, to we're actually looking at a piece of land over the course of the rotation, which could be in the United States, a 3-year rotation, in the UK or Europe, it could be an 8-year rotation. So it's 2 very different views.
And as you've been around basically before AgTech probably was a thing or became a thing in Silicon Valley and became a thing for investors. You've seen a lot, you've heard a lot, you've probably met most people in the space. What would you tell the listeners to this podcast who are, a big group of them are investors? They either investing their own capital, foundations capital, family office capital, etc. Where would you see, as you see this, you mentioned the last 2 years, the Regen Ag space is exploding, a lot of talk and work still needs to definitely catch up. Where would you tell them, obviously without giving investment advice, to look, to start, to engage? Where would you tell them to basically make the first steps if they want to become active in soil regeneration?
That's an interesting question that you pose, and so I'll give this a shot. I think investors in this space, whether they're ag tech investors or they're investors in specifically in regen ag or even in farmland investment, need to take a systems view, a holistic perspective on understanding the value proposition of what the technology is actually, the science and technology is actually delivering to the end customer. If the end customer is a primary producer, a grower, or if the customer is the entire supply chain, there's multiple value propositions. I think this whole notion of saying we have more diagnostics and we can detect and control soil diseases, that's interesting, but it's not a systems view. So looking at each individual technology almost as a point solution, those point solutions need to be brought together in order to deliver on, call it the holy grail of holistic management as it's characterized. But what it means is soil health means many things to many different people, and there have been many attempts to define what it is. I have some definitions here and some charts that basically represent what our customers think soil health is in the context of their objectives. And I think the challenge for investors in both technology companies as well as in other assets, whether they're investing in a farming business or in a piece of farmland, is to dig in to understand what those value propositions are of those investable entities as it relates to the outcomes. So an example might be looking at a soil disease diagnostic has value to individual growers because they can essentially minimize yield loss. But if you're a farmland investor, soil health means something very different to you. You're looking at the adaptive capacity of land. How do these tools and technologies actually improve the reliability of the crop that's being produced at a lower cost of production? And how does it support the tenets of what one calls regenerative agriculture? Things like minimizing soil disturbance through no-till cultivations, keeping the soil covered at all times by complementing main crops with cover crops to enhance soil fertility, and employing species diversification of companion crops. And that could be cover crops, or it could be cash crops in a zero rotation, or it could be growing different types of shade trees in a palm oil plantation. But the key tenet being you want to increase the diversity of soil microbes through the presence of pollinators and beneficial insects, while at the same time you're increasing the diversity of the plant species or the crop species that you're growing on a given piece of land. So to answer the question, what do investors need to look for? They need to have some understanding of the biology of the farming system and what the outcomes are that the asset is purporting to either being able to measure or deliver upon, depending upon if they're a tech company, a primary producer, like a food production company themselves, like a grower, or a farmland investor. So I think I would break it down into those three pieces.
And to ask a follow-up question on that, what would you do if you would be in charge of, let's say, a portfolio of 1 billion? So I'm deliberately putting a crazy amount of money out there, which is out there in terms of investment capital, but because I want the sector to start thinking about those numbers as we start approaching larger scale institutional investors that are asking questions about 10, 20, 100, in some cases 500 million. So what would you do if you would tomorrow morning be in charge of this fund as an investment? So it's an investment fund with 1 billion under management.
I think the first thing that I would ask, my LPs about is this an early stage fund? If it's $1 billion, you're looking at typically like PE later stage deals as opposed to having a portfolio of early, middle, and late stage funds. So the investment thesis of such a fund, if it's $1 billion.
Let's say you wake up, it's your personal finance. What would you do?
What would I do?
You can do whatever you want with it.
Okay, so I would design it so that it was doing all three things. So it would do multiple stages as opposed to restricting myself to a given stage. So I would allocate capital to early growth and later stage deals. The tech space is very slow to mature given adoption of the growers and understanding all the different measurement technologies and the application of science. I think we're going to see a lot of inflated valuations of companies that are being forced to raise more money than they need in order to have a real business in terms of revenue and profit.
So you would stay out of a lot of those deals, I imagine.
I would get into them, but in smaller rounds. So the average deal size would be smaller rounds for ag tech, and I would have more business fundamentals in terms of how I was evaluating the performance of each one of those assets. And if it was me managing the fund, we pretty much know the market. We would look to encourage B rounds of different companies that we thought had complementary technologies that we could string together in an ecosystem play. And, one of the investors that we've been talking to recently, they said, well, that looks like what you've developed here, and okay, so we have the whole block of Swiss cheese and here are the holes, and these are the companies that we think fill these gaps. So how does the industry move forward, and what is the role of a $1 billion fund in moving the tech piece of this forward in the context of adoption with growers? I think there's an interesting exercise, and it's more than an academic exercise that I would be willing to facilitate with a group of ag tech investors to show them what's missing in such an ecosystem play. And I think the industry really needs that. It doesn't need another fund. It needs a rationalization exercise to take place. That's more about making sense out of the solutions that have been developed as opposed to going after down rounds for companies that have inflated valuations. So that, I don't know if that answers part of your question.
Oh, definitely.
The other parts of the fund I would be focused on is tying some of these tools, particularly the ones on regenerative agriculture and soil health, to transition finance for regenerative, because one of the adoption things that we've seen just with pure ag tech is that it's slow because they want to see results before they buy into an annual recurring revenue. And so all these startups are choking on 1 and 200K deals. In order to get the run rates that investors want to see, you have to have more annual recurring revenue. And the only way you're going to get there is through trying to scale some of the technology. Regenerative agriculture is no different. I mean, the technologies are a bit different. The growers are typically more, how would I say this, evolved in their thinking, meaning they're more open to change, and they've been experimenting with different techniques for a very long time. The fact that we now have tools to codify and validate and provide scientific evidence around some of these regenerative agriculture practices, I think, is the phase that we're in now. So part of the fund I would use for transition finance for growers moving from what you might characterize as conventional or sustainable to regenerative practices. And then the third piece of the fund I would use and allocate to activities to join up the ag tech piece with the farmland investment community, who is doing a fantastic job as asset managers, but many of the business models of the farmland investment community are focused on managing assets like you would manage a REIT, a real estate investment trust, and they're still missing the piece on understanding how farm economics actually creates more value in the sale of the property, because a lot of those land valuations are tied directly to inflation as opposed to the productive capacity of land, and how do you achieve that potential given the change to regenerative practices. So I think there's a very big opportunity there, but that's what I would do with $1 billion. And if anyone's out there and wants to give me the money to do it, I'm ready to talk.
I'll give them your email.
Yes.
And let's say with the third or the trench on transition finance or finance, how would you approach that? As it's something that keeps coming back. Obviously, we're doing a series here on that specific topic. How would you approach if you had, let's say, 300 million or something in that neighborhood to put to work to help transition farmers that want to transition but maybe miss the finance part of it?
Yeah, I think part of it is under meeting people where they are and understanding where the starting point is. And you'd go through a segmentation exercise of understanding, what is the history of crop production. So it's not just dimensionalized by size of farm and what are they growing and what's the nature of the rotation, but what ambition do they have either on the revenue side of the equation or on profit. So there are a number of large farming organizations in North America that are, of the mindset that bigger is better. And we've worked with a number of them to actually grow more profitable crops on less land. So their costs go down, their margin goes up, but their revenue might also be smaller. So getting an understanding of the segmentation of the producers based upon their business objectives becomes really important. Is it growth, or is it margin, or is it both in terms of what they're after? And who owns them, I think, is the other thing. Are they family owned and operated? Do they own the land? Or are they renting land from either third parties that are growers or third parties that are investment companies? So getting your arms around the segmentation or the profile of the growers that would be involved in such a program for $300 million. And then there needs to be incentives for them. So it's not just, here, we'll pay you, a certain amount per acre of land converted to regenerative agriculture. It should tie to the value that they're getting off of the program. So you have to devise we call it a regenerative agriculture roadmap, an implementation plan. We just wrote one early this morning for a farm in the UK that's got 5,500 hectares of cropland and 1,000 hectares of permanent pasture for grazing 1,000 sheep.
Not small, yeah.
Not small. Well, it's a good size operator for this geography. Yeah. But in the US, it would be very small.
Of course. For a good return in terms of the condition and the context, it's not small for.
So how I would start with a $300 million transition finance business plan, if you will, is I would come up with the segmentation for who are the interested parties and how many of them are there, to understand what the total addressable market is given my fund size. And then how do I get them all adopted and achieving some return on investment within, say, 3 years' time, as opposed to 10 years' time or 11 years' time or 12 years' time. If we go back and look at our own experience in implementing some of these soil health programs across the rotation, we have examples where we've delivered 100% benefits in 24 months. We have other examples where it took us almost 10 years to get to the same spot. And the producers may not be calling those projects regenerative agriculture projects because that's terminology that they may not be familiar with. So what they're interested in doing is figuring out how they can manipulate soil biology to lower their cost of production and have a more reliable crop is basically what it comes down to. Getting them out of the thinking that they can just add soil microbes and magic happens. It's like convincing somebody not to take a diet pill because, they need to do the hard work.
TV, yeah.
Exercise. Yeah, it's kind of like that. But yeah, that's what I would do with the 300 million. You'd have to profile and figure out which growers you want to approach and how many of them are.
And if it would be you, where would you go first, or what kind of crops or what kind of situations do you think are the most exciting at the moment?
I think there's 5 different places and geographies and cropping systems to consider. And it all depends upon what you're trying to achieve for your limited partners. I think the first...
In this case, you're the only limited partner, so you can... What do you...
Okay, it's my money. Okay, you really put me on the spot here. I think...
That's my job.
The 5 different scenarios are the United States, where you have, 2/3 of the country growing corn and soybeans and maybe some small grains intermixed with, field vegetables and then specialty crops, primarily in places like California and the West Coast, is a very different starting point than a place like Australia, where you have a lot of regenerative agriculture already going on, given the grazing and what they've done with cereal production. However, they could be doing a better job of integrating those two things together and increasing the productive capacity of where they're growing wheat and growing the right varieties that are more drought resilient and creating more resilience to water. I mean, Australia has been in a drought for a long time, but there's some of the smartest people in the world there working on strategies to keep the water cycle moving, which is the whole reason why we're having the fires there now. I would say that's a very different scenario than Northern Europe, where we are today in the UK or even in the Netherlands, where you have a very broad diversity of soils because they've been farming here for 3,000 years. So there's a lot of biological diversity of soils. In particular, you have a lot of diseases that present limiting factors to things like potato production. So an example is a potato cyst nematode or soil fusarium, or Apomyces for peas. So you have a lot of challenges with yield decline, given improper management of soils in long rotations. The other geographies are sub-Saharan Africa, and the last one would be Southeast Asia. So in sub-Saharan Africa, you have a huge opportunity to use regenerative agriculture practices to build and design the right fertility profiles of soils to grow different crops in different conditions. So, I mean, it's like starting on day one, how would you grow barley for a beer supply chain? What varieties do you need? You have access to water, and where would you put, a beer manufacturing, a miller and a brewery for the product. So the African continent represents a frontier. We do some work there, and most of it's around setting up vertically integrated supply chains for smallholder farmers that are part of outgrower networks that tie to a commercial farm that then ties to some food or beverage processing to consumers. So we see the African continent as being a very interesting place to deploy regenerative agriculture practices. And then I think Indonesia and places in the Southeast Asia present challenging environments for moving from monoculture, things like palm oil and rubber plantations, to regenerative perennial tropical systems that have many more constraints around biodiversity and habitat and deforestation risk, given all of the activity around land use change. So one of the big reasons for the slash and burn in both Brazil and Indonesia, and we're working in both places now, is down to not optimizing the productivity of the commodity and the plantations, so they clear more land in order to grow more of the crop. So we think regenerative agriculture has a strategic role in the context of those farming systems to increase the adaptive capacity of the plantation by diversifying the number of crops that are actually grown in that geography. I think one of the critical components is the governance and the legislation and how that gets implemented in those geographies. They're developing countries, and you need to provide economic opportunity for the smallholder farmers on the ground. The other aspect is the biodiversity and habitat. There's a large number of endangered species in those geographies that need to be protected. The good news is that we can plan and implement for all of that in the context of having something that works. So it doesn't need to be all swung in the other direction, which is, to conservation and setting aside all of the land and not doing anything with it. I think it's more about getting really creative with how you preserve the natural landscape in the context of valuing the externalities. And in the case of Indonesia, the value of natural capital is, say, much higher than it would be in Arizona, just based upon the diversity of species that are in that geography. So it's a longer question you asked me. So what would you do first? You really need to understand the characterization of the farming system as well as the natural environment in which it exists, in order to prioritize where regenerative agriculture can play the biggest role in terms of creating not just nature-based solutions, but business benefits for the producers.
Yeah, and I think that's the role of any investor. If somebody has $1 billion or not, or €10 or $10, is to see where are those leverage points, where in the context of you as an investor, but obviously also in the context of where you are interacting with, and how can you put that to work in something diversified, obviously from the risk perspective, but also to have potential exposure to things that are going to happen over the next years. And we're going to see more shocks. We're going to see more opportunities, either on nutrient density, either on ecosystem services and payments. We might finally going to see more and more carbon payments and water payments and biodiversity payments, etc., which some pieces are there yet, and they might come, just we don't know when and how they're exactly going to be implemented. So you would like to have exposure to that, obviously without running enormous risks. So it's the constant play in something that is very biological and growing and emerging. And 10 years ago or 2 years ago, it was completely different.
I think the challenge there is, where the revenue streams and the development of markets around natural capital. it's been a long time coming. We've been doing this work for 10 years, and my CFO keeps telling me, stop working on that. Nobody's voting with their balance sheet yet.
Do you think it's the year 2020? We're at the beginning now. Do you think?
Yeah, are we there? Because we've quantified it. And we have a data set for most major geographies on a lot of the externalities of different production outcomes. And the projects where we've been provisioning that data and creating value for producers have been around lawsuits for nitrate leaching and renegotiating laws around erosion and sediment transport. So it's all been backwards, if you will. So thinking about litigation risk, it's like the climate risk discussion. You have litigation risk and quantifying that, as well as how could climate disrupt your business, meaning you have no revenue as a result of having stranded assets. So I think the financial services community is further along in their thinking about risk than the agricultural community, which views risk really in the context of staying alive.
And if you risk as a hail storm or something like that, and it happens every now and then, and you get insurance for it.
Yeah. So we do provide data sets that are used for crop insurance. We have our own crop insurance products, and most of that's around drought, pests, and disease. And we've developed some parametric products that essentially finance the mitigation in advance of the loss, so that there is no loss. So it's not a premium in a claim like a multi-peril crop insurance product. It's a parametric product that gets financed somehow, either through an insurance company. Sometimes it's coming through the supply chain as supply chain finance from the buyer of tea that finances supplemental irrigation to producers of tea, the farmers themselves, to have access to irrigation for a period of time so they don't have a crop failure. And so we have an example in Kenya where we spend $5 million on supplemental irrigation, which prevented a $500 million problem with the supply of the crop in the commodity market, which represented something like 20% of the world's tea supply. So parametric insurance does play a role with agricultural commodities, given climate change. I think that the challenge with looking at risk in the context of climate from how the banks think about it and how the regulatory community thinks about it, they're thinking more about catastrophic risk as it relates to physical assets on landscape and less about natural capital. And I think the reason for that is they don't understand natural capital. It's like trying to teach bankers how to be farmers.
Which is very, very difficult. Yeah. It's the whole growing stuff.
We've been doing a lot of it. I said before this call, we're on the call talking about the past, the early investors that we pitched for this company in Silicon
Valley. You did a lot of education. Yeah.
They said, you're actually going to go work with the farmers? What are you, crazy? And now all the bankers are coming to us and saying, can you tell us about soil health? So, it's interesting. It's all flipped around.
We came a long way, yeah.
Yes.
I want to be conscious of your time, and this is not the last time we're talking, I imagine. So I want to finalize with some questions. And the first one, if you could have a magic wand and tomorrow morning we wake up and Stephanie has changed one thing in the agriculture industry or the food industry, what would that be?
Oh, it's a very good question. I would say implementing some of the scientific innovation that we've created at scale so that these methods start to take off. And examples of that are being able to sequence the DNA of the air to identify evidence of inoculum in in situ infection conditions for meteorology to inform disease risk, and then actually, proactively come up with crop protection programs that are fit for purpose, given different disease risk profiles globally.
What does it mean in plain English?
In plain English, what all that means is we can detect things in the environment that growers can't see, that if they were using the information, they would lower their carbon footprint of the food production process, and it would save them a lot of money. What I'm saying to you is I think the industry, both ag tech as well as the regen ag space, they're all focused on trying to understand how to quantify soil carbon, how to understand the relationship between soil health and crop productivity. But not many people are looking at cost and risk in the context of the balance sheet of the producers, which is essentially the starting point for where these producers are coming from. So what would make me most satisfied in terms of our work in the marketplace is to have some of these innovations scale, not just on the implementation of the technology, but also on the value that we're creating on the balance sheets of the producers and their customers in the supply chain.
And what do you believe to be true about regenerative agriculture that others don't believe to be true? And this question definitely is inspired by John Kemp, who uses it very often in his podcast. Okay, so I think this is really hard because I'm not sure how many people would agree with what I have to say, but that's exactly the point. Yeah. Everyone's talking about regenerative agriculture, starting with grazing, incorporating livestock into a rotation, whether it's cattle on grass, pigs on stubble, turnips, chickens, whatever it is. We've experimented with different holistic management practices and different farming systems, both on permanent pasture, independent of a cropping system for, say, cereals or field vegetables. And then we've done these integrated projects where we're looking at the efficacy of grazing on soil fertility, soil structure, and water holding capacity, and how that improves productivity of the land in subsequent years of growing a crop on a piece of land that was grazed. So I don't think that there's enough discussion about the whole systems approach, which includes livestock as a complementary attribute of an arable cropping system. I think understanding the interplay between these two things is essential in terms of how we bring arable farmland in terms of soil fertility to the place where it needs to be the fastest. And I think the reason for this is many of the cereal and vegetable farmers don't necessarily want to manage livestock because they've specialized in their own methods and they view livestock as a drag on their P&L. And a lot of work. Yeah, it's a lot of work. You got to be there. And a very different work, obviously, from something they have been specialized in the last 20, 30 years. Maybe if you went to their fathers or their grandfathers, it would be a different thing. But for them. Yeah. And so I think there's an opportunity there for livestock producers to rent out their cattle and services. And we've helped a number of them do that actually here in the UK to provide soil fertility services where they graze their cattle on somebody else's land on a 4-year lay, and then they get paid on the nutrient benefits of what has been created in the future season of production in terms of soil health. I always do this. It's the last question I say, but then it's actually not. How did that work? So you helped a livestock grazer basically get a contract with an arable farmer, and then the payment was connected to the nutrients the livestock brought to the farm? That's right, as measured by the productivity improvement of the crops in a subsequent season of growing. But you need to be able to connect that to the livestock. It cannot be something else. Like otherwise the farmer says, yeah, but actually it was my fertilizer or it was my management or et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, so we do measurements like before and after the grass was lay was planted. We ran the monitoring program for the cattle grazing on the piece of land. And so we understand how much soil organic matter was built up over what period of time. And it's the attribution of that management practice to the rotation, which we have in our analytics platform, is essentially a way to forecast how much of the future benefit can be attributed to the livestock grazing versus what crop he grew in between. Now, being able to discern like one thing from the next, now we're getting into, I say the weeds, but we're getting into the, the details of how that. Unintended. Yeah, unintended, pun and intended, unintended and intended pun. I think that the challenge there has to do with what is the grower actually valuing? They're valuing soil organic matter accumulation and nutrient availability in the soil based upon what the next crop in the rotation actually needs. So you're essentially creating the context for nutrient availability in the soil, say 6 months before the next crop actually needs access to those nutrients. And so the question is, well, what happens over the winter? Don't we lose anything? So we're monitoring what happens when there's, when you're growing, say, cover crops in the winter. And you're saying basically that the impact you've seen in these concrete examples of livestock as smartly part of a holistic rotation has been quite big, and we need to have that discussion more often, how to integrate livestock. Yeah, it's the next chapter in the discussion that's currently going on with the Regen Ag community, where they're thinking about all of these things as separate things, because they're just defining what
what is the term? So what do we get if we do cover crops? What happens if we do grazing? But they're looking at it in short time horizons and more as a point solution to say, what happens if I change this management practice, as opposed to looking at the whole system? What are they trying to do across the rotation? And how do all these practices stack up in the context of it's a multivariate problem. So no one single regenerative agriculture practice will deliver all the benefits. And I think that's the challenge, even on the scientific side of this. Our science team from Colorado State in the USDA having very long discussions about what is regenerative agriculture, why isn't the academic community picked this up and actually started to publish papers on this. So we have assembled a literature review, something like 150 papers that refer to all different aspects of these practices, but bringing that together in the context of what farmers do in a management tool is something that has been very slow to come to market. I think a lot of it has to do with, if there's no demand for it, people aren't going to ask for something that they don't know they need.
I think Steve Jobs said that, right? Or something.
Yeah, something like that. But yeah, so I know that was your last question. Hopefully I've answered it.
No, absolutely. I think it comes back to something you've mentioned before, and actually something we've been discussing often in the podcast, that holistic view and that all systems approach that we need, as it's such a complex system that we're dealing with, and we're trying to simplify it a lot. And that has had great benefits, but also got us into a lot of trouble. So the steps back basically are going to be difficult because we don't know many of these things. We do know many of them, but they're very siloed, and connecting them both from the science part to the farmer's part while running a system that keeps going every year and getting more extreme is just extremely complex, but extremely interesting and exciting. So I want to thank you so much for your time. And definitely I'll be checking in with you what the rest of this year brings and the next years. I think it's extremely exciting to have this conversation with someone who has been in the space for such a while.
Thank you.
If you found the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food podcast valuable, there are a few simple ways you can use to support it. Number 1, rate and review the podcast on your podcast app. That's the best way for other listeners to find the podcast, and it only takes a few seconds. Number 2, share this podcast on social media or email it to your friends and colleagues. Number 3, if this podcast has been of value to you, and if you have the means, please join my Patreon community to help grow this platform and allow me to take it further. You can find all the details on patreon.com/regenerative agriculture or in the description below. Thank you so much, and see you at the next podcast. Dear friends of the podcast, I'm super excited to share with you the online video course Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food. How to put money to work in regenerating soils at scale and growing a lot of tasty food while doing it. Why are we doing this course? After 100 interviews and more than 100 hours of audio asking the question how to put money to work in regenerating soils, and have been following the space since 2011 and recording these podcasts since 2016, we thought it was time to share our lessons learned. What have we seen in the space over the last years? How have we built our decision-making framework? What to focus on with the podcast? How have we picked interviewees? And what questions should you ask? What is happening in the space? What should you read? What should you listen? What should you watch? How to approach this space? For whom is this course? You, the soil builders and investors in this space. The soil builders, people working in this space, entrepreneurial farmers, fund managers, vehicle builders, crowd investing, platform builders, agtech companies, farm-to-gut food companies, permaculture, keyline designers, holistic management consultants, etc., etc. People that are building soil at scale. And the investors who are putting their own money to work through their family office or as private individuals, or people who are putting other people's money to work through foundations, institutional capital, banks, insurance companies, etc. Is this course free? No. This is pay what you think it's worth. Meaning, I have no way of knowing what this course will be worth to you. And I'm very aware that among the listeners of this podcast, we have people with very different means. So I'm inviting you, if this course is creating value to you, and if you have the means, to consider paying what you think it's worth. Thank you. So what is this course? It's currently a series of 17 videos, mostly ranging from 10 to 15 minutes, plus PDF slides, so you don't have to ride along. we're going to look into why invest in regenerative agriculture and why extractive agriculture is so risky, how to invest, what kind of frameworks you could and I think should build, what to invest in, what kind of co-investors you could find, or what kind of investors you could find if you're a soy builder. Every lesson will have a digging deeper part where I will share what kind of reports, what kind of interviews, what kind of videos you can look into if you want to dig deeper. We're going to look at nutrient density, landscape design, and a lot more. So what is it not? It's not a list of investable deals. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist in this world. We're really at the beginning of the regenerative agriculture and food revolution. It's also not investment advice. Before making any investment, please find professional investment advice. So get ready, get a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, or whatever you're drinking. Click on the link below, sign up, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback.